Immigration patterns to the United States changed significantly in the late 19th century. Until the 1880s, a majority of immigrants to the United States came from Northern and Western Europe and were Protestant Christians. The main exception was a large influx of Irish Catholic immigrants in the 1840s and the 1850s. This changed in the early 1880s, with large numbers of Catholic and Jewish immigrants arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. The settlement patterns of immigrants also shifted in the 1880s, with recent arrivals more likely to settle in the cities of the Northeast and Midwest than earlier generations of immigrants who were more likely to settle in the rural areas. The settlement pattern of immigrants was part of a larger trend in urbanization in the United States. Not only were new immigrants settling in urban areas, Americans from rural areas were also increasingly moving to cities in search of economic opportunities, and in some cases, just a plain escape from boredom and isolation of the rural lifestyle. The influx of people caused the size of American cities to grow rapidly in the late 19th century, and high demand for housing meant that there were few good options for new arrivals. Many poor immigrants and migrants from within the country settled in tenements, which were small rental units, often consisting of only one room. Life in tenements varied from city to city and from building to building, but the conditions were often unsanitary and overcrowded. The tenements in New York City were especially infamous for their terrible living conditions. Single rooms were commonly occupied by multiple families, or as many as a dozen single occupants. They also did not have private bathrooms. Many units also lacked running water and electricity, and some even lacked windows for ventilation or natural sunlight. These living conditions had serious consequences for resident tenement dwellers in New York, and most of them suffered from much higher rates of infectious disease, infant mortality, and things like crime than those living in less densely populated and impoverished areas in the city. How Jacob Riis immigrated to the United States from Denmark in 1870 when he was 20 years old. He arrived in New York City with nearly no money and worked a variety of odd jobs before entering the newspaper business. In 1877, Riis took a job as a police reporter for the New York Tribune. As part of his job, Riis would often accompany the police to some of New York City's most impoverished and crime-ridden neighborhoods. This gave him a first-hand look at the living conditions in those tenements. His experiences convinced him that something needed to be done to improve the living conditions of the poor, and he became a housing reformer in New York City, supporting efforts to change the city's housing laws and policies. In 1887, Riis learned that German inventors had created a new type of, quote, flashlight powder, which would be used to photograph dark spaces. The flash powder, which was a combination of like magnesium and potassium chloride, was ignited with a spark, sending a cloud of fire and sparks into the air that would illuminate a space long enough for a photograph to be taken. Riis saw the potential of this innovation for photographing the windowless interiors of tenements and the dark alleyways that surrounded them. Over the next decade, Riis used new flash technology and a small detective camera, as he called it, to take hundreds of photographs of New York's poorest neighborhoods and those people who lived in them. Some of Riis's photographs were posed, with participants sitting for portraits. Others were candid, with the subjects unaware that they were being photographed. Riis would sometimes enter tenements and surprise tenants with a blinding flash, fleeing before they knew what happened. This photograph shows a family of Eastern European immigrants in their one-room tenement. The room served as both their home and workplace. Riis reported that members of this family worked 17 hours a day, 7 days a week, making cigars in the room, and that the cramped space reeked of toxic fumes. Notice the flash from Riis's flashlight powder in the window on the left. Riis hoped to use his photographs to convince others to support housing reform. In 1888, he created a slideshow lecture called The Other Half: How It Lives and Dies in New York. The presentation included about 100 images on glass slides that he showed with a, quote, magic lantern, which was like an early type of projector. Riis narrated the slides as he displayed them, and he was an excellent storyteller. He was able to blend humor, sympathy, and basically hard data about the effects of poverty in New York. The presentation received rave reviews, and his lecture was soon in high demand. In the coming years, Riis would travel for months at a time delivering the lecture across the country, and he'd probably charge about $150 per lecture. Much of the popularity of Riis's lectures stemmed from the power of the images that he selected. Riis chose photos that were compelling and troubling to his middle-class audiences, few of whom had seen urban poverty up close. The photograph shown here, which Riis titled Bandit's Roost, shows an alley between tenement buildings in Mulberry Bend, one of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. On the left is a young mother with her children. On the right is a group of toughs staring warily at the camera. Riis likely knew that this image would have played to his audience's concern about children living in poverty and stoked their fears of crime and violence in poor immigrant neighborhoods. So you need to stop and think to yourself, why do you think Riis selected images that would have been shocking or troubling to his audiences? In 1889, an editor from Scribner's attended Riis's lecture and offered him $150 to write an article for the widely read magazine. The article eventually led to a book deal in 1890 for How the Other Half Lives. In this influential book, Riis described the squalid conditions in the tenements and the lifestyles of poor immigrants who lived in New York's poorest slums. Riis also argued that the problems of the poor were caused by bad housing conditions, not heredity, and that the worst effects of urban poverty could be alleviated by better housing and good government policies. How the Other Half Lived was widely read and helped spawn the Progressive Era movement for more effective urban government and better housing for the poor. Even more broadly, Riis's groundbreaking work served as an inspiration for generations of progressive photographers and journalists who have sought to promote change and advocate for the poor. So that kind of brings us to our central historical question. Today I'm going to have you analyze 4 photographs by Jacob Riis that portray poor immigrants living in New York City from 1887 to about 1892. I'm going to have you analyze those documents and then answer the question, what were conditions like in New York City tenements in the late 19th century? So first, I'm going to have you read the excerpt from How the Other Half Lives and answer those questions. And then I'll have you move on to looking at the documents and I'll give you further instruction on those things.